it going, everyone? Welcome to 101 Performance. Today I am starting the blueprint series for my Turbo D16 out of my 2000 Honda Civic. We're starting out this series talking about piston rings and ring gap, why you need to do it, or at least check it. So, in most circumstances, when you order a set of pistons, they come with a set of rings. For instance, these here are my Vitara low compression pistons that came with Hastings rings. The pistons are 75.5 millimeter overbore. And we basically wanted to double check ring gap because with a lot of aftermarket rings, especially on the cheaper end, being that these are from eBay, you just kind of want to check those things before you do your final installation. You wouldn't want anything to go wrong and destroy a perfectly good engine. So what we're talking about is ring gap. And basically what that is, if you can see this ring, it is not a full circle. It is split. So this is what allows you to get it onto the piston because the ring can be opened and flexed to go onto the piston into the ring lands. But when it's sitting inside the bore, those two gaps need to be as tight as possible, but without expanding whenever it gets hot and making contact. So that's where ring gap comes into play. And ring gap can be set up differently from engine to engine, and especially depending on what you plan to use your engine for. So a good equation on how to figure out what your ring gap should be is first to determine what your plans are for it. So for instance, my plan is a turbo engine. And based off of some research that I got from Wisico or Wiseco, not really sure how it's pronounced, for a turbo engine, they recommend that you do a number of 0.006 or 6/1000ths of an inch, and then multiply that number by the size of your cylinder bore in inches, and that will give you your ring gap. In my case, my top ring should be 16/1000ths of an inch. For my second ring, it's slightly larger than that at 17/1000ths of an inch. So with that said, these have actually already been checked, and good job from Hastings because all of them were fairly well within spec and didn't require much grinding at all. I actually only had one ring that was actually just a little too tight. Everything else was spot on. So I wanted to talk about how you check piston ring gap. So basically, you're going to need a couple tools to do a piston ring gap job, if you will. You're going to need a piston ring depth setter, which is something that's going to set the piston ring in the bore square about 1 inch down. It's important that it's square, otherwise your readings will be skewered. You will need a feeler gauge and obviously some piston rings and an engine. So to do this job, what you're going to start out with is to set the ring into the bore in a vertical manner, just so that it's hanging on in there. Roll it flat, and then if you don't have a piston ring depth setter or you can't get a hold of one, another option is to take an old piston ring off the engine that you have disassembled and to put it on the oil ring, which is the third ring down from the top of the piston, and to take that and use it to set the ring down into the bore. So once you set it down, this ring that you just put on the oil galley will stop the piston roughly about 3/4 to an inch down inside the cylinder bore. The next thing you're going to need is your feeler gauge. And like I had said earlier, for my engine, after using the equation to figure out what my gap should be, my top ring should be at 16/1000ths of an inch. Alright, so I had to move the camera just a little closer. But on a feeler gauge, there are numbers. And hopefully I can get the camera to focus for this. There we go. So like I said, my top ring is sorry, my top ring is 16 thousandths of an inch, or 0.016. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to take that feeler gauge, or the one that's specified for your engine. You're going to slip it into the groove of the piston ring, and you're going to try to drag the feeler gauge up and down. And what you want to feel is just a little bit of resistance as you move it through the piston gap. If there is no resistance, that means the ring gap is too large, and if you're already at spec, I highly recommend getting a new set of rings. If you cannot fit the feeler gauge in it, it's best to keep dropping down in sizes on the feeler gauge and find one that actually does fit, and it gives you an idea of about how far you're going to need to grind back the piston gap. If by chance you do have to grind the piston ring, you can find a piston ring filer on eBay or Amazon for around $40 to $50, or you could probably even take your block and rings to a machine shop and they'll do it for you for fairly cheap. So now that you know how to check them, there's one other thing that's highly important when you're doing your piston rings, and that is this here. So the top ring has no special markings, or see if I can't get that to focus. So the top ring has no special markings. In fact, it's just a, I believe, cast iron ring. I honestly have no idea what they're made of for my application. But there's no markings, and they do have a black coating on them. Nothing super special about them. They're not orientated any particular way. However, the second ring has a small mark on it right there, and also on the underside, if you can see that, there is a small lip. The reason for this is because this is both a compression ring and an oil scraping ring. It serves a dual purpose. This has to be installed with that dot facing upward. If you turn it around the other direction and face it the other way, what you're going to encounter is a seat or a piston ring that never is going to seal correctly, and in fact is going to cause a lot of blow-by. So like I had stated before, all of my ring gaps were all within spec with the exception of one. I did already file that ring, and I did use a hand file because I have a really fine hand file, and the number it was off by was so minimum that it didn't really take much of a fine hand file to take it off, and it was perfectly within spec. So once all your ring gaps are put within spec, you're going to install the rings onto the piston. Now, the top ring and the secondary ring are both compression rings, and when you set them on there, you need to make sure that the gaps right here are not in the same location. The piston rings need to be clocked. On the oil ring, there is one on the bottom, one on the top, and a wave ring in the center. These all also have gaps. However, they're not near as important to set the gap as long as they're in between about or roughly around 18 thousandths. In fact, most manufacturers don't even specify a number for the oil ring. Since we're blueprinting this engine, it is a good idea to have a build sheet. Again, I can put this down in the description. There are multiple versions of blueprint sheets that you can find on Google, and most of them free. You can just print them out like I did this one. But basically all it is something that has all the information that you're going to keep track of as you build your engine. Well guys, that's all I have for today on piston ring gap. If you haven't seen any of my other videos, you can check them out on my channel. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/one-of-one-performance, where we will be giving away a set of YCP pistons for a D series engine. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.